Imagine a young king, ravaged by leprosy, leading a fragile kingdom surrounded by enemies, threatened by internal betrayals and imminent collapse. Now imagine that same king marching into the heart of Muslim Syria on a daring expedition, guided by reckless advisors and driven by political calculations that defied the logic of survival. This is the backdrop of the Siege of Aleppo, a frequently overlooked episode, but one that marks one of the most controversial moments in the reign of Baldwin of Jerusalem. In this video, we will delve into the year 1177, when the leper king decided to support a Muslim ally against Saladin, launching the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem into a disastrous campaign. A military expedition that, instead of strengthening the Crusaders' position, exposed the fragility of their foreign policy and the risk of poorly calculated alliances. Stay until the end and discover how this bold incursion to the north had lasting consequences for Baldwin and his besieged kingdom. A story of bravery, precarious diplomacy, and choices that perhaps should never have been made. The Siege of Aleppo shows us that in the Holy Land, every misstep could cost far more than a simple military defeat. In the 12th century, the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem was a fragile island of Christian power, amidst a rising Islamic world in the process of reorganization. Since the First Crusade, the Crusader states faced the constant challenge of maintaining their borders against expanding Muslim powers, such as Fatimid Egypt and, above all, the Zengids in Syria. Saladin, then Sultan of Egypt, was consolidating his influence after uniting Egypt and Syria under his command. In this context of external threats and internal divisions, Baldwin, still very young and newly crowned, sought to assert his authority and protect his domains. Tensions were rising. The year was 1177. Baldwin, only 16 years old and already showing the visible signs of leprosy, effectively took command of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. Despite his youth and illness, he displayed a combative spirit and sharp political intelligence. However, the Siege of Aleppo would come to demonstrate the limits of these qualities when subjected to the pressures of Crusader diplomacy and fragile alliances with local Syrian lords. The episode begins with a proposal from the Atabeg of Mosul, Saif ad-Din Ghazi II, a direct rival of Saladin. While Saladin advanced to consolidate his control over Syria, Saif ad-Din sought to weaken him by joining forces with the Crusaders in a joint effort to besiege the strategic city of Aleppo, a stronghold of the Zengid family. For Baldwin, this seemed like an irresistible opportunity to strike Saladin on his northern flank before he could fully secure his dominance over the region. The proposal was warmly welcomed by influential figures at the Jerusalem court, especially by the Grand Master of the Templars and some nobles who saw the agreement as a chance to expand Christian territory. William of Tyre, a chronicler of the time, reveals that despite the enthusiasm, there was also hesitation. Many doubted the sincerity of the Muslims and feared an ambush or a logistical collapse in the heart of Syria. Even so, Baldwin approved the march. The king departed from Jerusalem with a respectable force: Templar troops, contingents from the kingdom's major noble houses, and the company of Count Raymond III of Tripoli, who supported the expedition with clear reservations. The campaign was bold. The Crusaders intended to cross hostile territories and join the Zengid army in the siege of a well-fortified city far from their supply lines. The siege began in the outskirts of Aleppo in the autumn of that year. Initially, the coordination between the Crusaders and their Muslim allies seemed to work. The Zengid and Christian troops maintained a tenuous collaboration, setting up separate camps but aligning them against the city. The sight of Christian and Muslim soldiers fighting side by side was a rare and disturbing spectacle for many. However, the resistance of Aleppo, led by forces loyal to Nur ad-Din and to Saladin's faction, proved formidable. The defenders were well supplied, protected by fortified walls, and enjoyed the fervent support of the local population. Over the weeks, the Crusaders' assaults failed repeatedly and morale began to decline. The siege stalled. Soon, problems began to pile up. Cooperation between the Crusaders and the Zengids deteriorated rapidly. Mutual suspicions, language barriers, and cultural differences made a unified strategy nearly impossible. Moreover, rumors reached the Christian camp that Saladin was marching north with a large army to relieve Aleppo. The prospect of a direct confrontation with the Sultan in hostile territory caused panic among the Latin commanders. It was at this point that Baldwin faced a dilemma. Maintaining the siege meant risking the annihilation of his force and the loss of political influence. Withdrawing meant admitting the expedition's failure and weakening the kingdom's position in the eyes of its Muslim allies and its own Crusader barons. After intense debates and pressure from the Count of Tripoli and the masters of the military orders, the decision was made to retreat. The return march was an ordeal. The withdrawal occurred under constant threat of ambushes by hostile tribes and Saladin's spies. In addition, the physical and psychological exhaustion of the troops was evident. Baldwin, even weakened by leprosy, remained mounted for long stretches, displaying a courage that impressed even his adversaries. Upon returning to Crusader territory, the king was met with a mix of relief and disappointment. The expedition to Aleppo, far from resulting in territorial gains or military glory, had exposed the vulnerability of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, the ineffectiveness of opportunistic alliances, and the growing threat that Saladin represented. Even though there was no formal defeat on the battlefield, the Siege of Aleppo was a strategic failure. Saladin further solidified his image as the defender of Islam against a divided Christendom, while Baldwin, though admired for his bravery, saw his authority weakened among the kingdom's nobles. The episode left deep marks. It taught the Crusaders that temporary alliances with Muslim factions could not replace a cohesive foreign policy, and that bold incursions without logistical guarantees could compromise the entire structure of the kingdom. It was, as later chroniclers would say, a march against the impossible, led by a king whose flesh suffered, but whose spirit still refused to yield to fate. The failure of the Siege of Aleppo was not merely an unsuccessful military episode. It revealed deeper fissures in the very political fabric of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem and exposed a strategic fragility that would be gradually exploited by the kingdom's enemies. Baldwin, upon returning from the expedition, was received with formal honors, but behind the scenes there was mistrust and recrimination. Internally, many began to question the young king's judgment. Despite his courage being widely acknowledged, even by his adversaries, the decision to trust a Muslim lord who was a rival of Saladin was seen by some of the nobility as reckless. Raymond of Tripoli, who had supported the campaign reluctantly, used the disastrous outcome to strengthen his political position and present himself as a prudent and stable alternative to the monarch, especially among the lords, more skeptical of Baldwin's ability to rule wisely given his physical condition. The relationship with the military orders, especially the Knights Templar, was also shaken. Although the Templars had fought bravely during the siege, many of them blamed the Jerusalem court for the lack of planning and the strategic indecision that led to the retreat. This erosion of trust between the king and the military orders would be a recurring problem in the following years. From a diplomatic standpoint, the impact was equally profound. The alliance with Saif ad-Din Ghazi II, besides proving ineffective, had serious consequences for the Christian reputation in the eyes of the Muslim world. Saladin, in his propaganda, did not hesitate to highlight what he called the hypocrisy of the Crusaders, who allied with Muslims to attack other Muslims. He used this episode to fuel the spirit of jihad against the Latin kingdoms and to consolidate the support of Syrian and Egyptian populations for his leadership. Strategically, the attempt to take Aleppo had been, at its core, a risky gamble. Even if the siege had succeeded, Maintaining control of such a distant city, surrounded by hostile territories, would have been nearly impossible for the Crusader army, which was already suffering from chronic logistical limitations. The expedition thus exposed the limits of Jerusalem's military capacity and showed that maintaining its already fragile borders was a more urgent challenge than expansionist adventures to the north. It is also important to highlight the moral effect of the failure. Many knights and soldiers, especially those coming from Europe, found themselves demoralized after the campaign. The aura of invincibility that some had attributed to the Crusaders was severely damaged. For the local peoples, both Christian and Muslim, the episode reinforced the perception that the Latin kingdoms were sustained more by luck and diplomacy than by real strength. However, not all was lost. Baldwin, even surrounded by criticism, earned a kind of lasting respect for his tenacity and ability to endure physical and political adversity. Unlike many Crusader kings who hid behind their advisors, Baldwin showed presence on the battlefield, personally commanding even with a weakened body. This example of direct leadership helped solidify his image as a warrior king and contributed to maintaining relative unity in his government in the following years. Later, the king would take measures to ensure that the mistake of Aleppo would not be repeated. He strengthened surveillance on the southern borders, doubled efforts in the defense of Galilee and the county of Tripoli, and began acting more cautiously in political alliances. The costly lesson from the northern campaign seemed to have matured his understanding that the survival of the kingdom depended above all on prudence and restraint. The disappointment with Aleppo also had a significant impact on how the Crusaders began to deal with the Muslim powers in the region. Trust in temporary alliances and agreements of convenience diminished, and Crusader policy adopted a more defensive posture. This, however, did not mean weakness. On the contrary, Baldwin used the following years to reorganize military forces and prepare for the inevitable confrontations with Saladin, which were becoming increasingly imminent. In the religious sphere, the episode had ambiguous implications. While some clergymen saw the failure as divine punishment for associating with infidels, others, such as William of Tyre, recorded the episode with a tone more political than spiritual. There was a growing understanding that the Crusaders could no longer rely solely on religious fervor to sustain their campaigns. The geopolitical reality of the region demanded cold calculation and more refined strategies. In the end, the Siege of Aleppo became established in the memory of the time as a warning. A harsh lesson that not every enemy of Saladin was a trustworthy ally, and that the Crusades were increasingly ceasing to be merely holy wars and becoming complex clashes between regional powers, with fragile alliances, constant betrayals, and conflicting interests. Baldwin survived the mistake, and that survival in itself was remarkable. Few monarchs of his era faced so many challenges, physical, political and military, with the same dignity and determination. The Siege of Aleppo, although a strategic failure, helped shape the king who in the following years would face Saladin in decisive battles, becoming one of the most enigmatic and respected figures in the history of the Crusades. The Siege of Aleppo was more than a poorly planned campaign. It was a turning point in Baldwin's reign, a bitter lesson that revealed the dangers of fragile alliances, the recklessness of excessive ambition, and the vulnerability of a Christian kingdom surrounded by enemies increasingly united under Saladin's leadership. However, amid the failure, the image also emerged of a determined king who, even consumed by leprosy, never backed down from the responsibilities of the throne and the defense of his faith. Baldwin did face harsh political consequences, yes, but he also emerged as a more mature, more cautious ruler, and still deeply respected. His name, which could have been buried under the errors of that expedition, continued to be remembered with admiration by chroniclers and warriors. If you enjoyed discovering this lesser-known side of the Leper King, like this video, share it with others who are also interested in the history of the Crusades, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Here we reveal the shadows and glories of figures who shaped the destiny of medieval Christendom. Until the next chapter in the journey of Baldwin, the king who defied the impossible.